Our first plant is Selaginella watsonii, Watson's spike moss. This plant is a member of the lycophytes. Lycophytes are a group of plants, it's a monophyletic group that have vascular tissue, they have roots, and then they reproduce by spores, which is similar to how ferns reproduce, except they have much, much smaller leaves. And if you can look here, the leaves are really small on there. This particular species of Selaginella grows in the central and southern Sierra Nevada mountain range at very high elevations. So in the winter, there's no water because everything is frozen and this plant's dormant. During the summer, there's only very brief periods of time when there's water during the spring and during any thunderstorms. And this plant has adaptations to deal with that. It can go dormant during times of no water. It'll turn brown and actually look almost like it's dead. But then if there's water present, it'll rehydrate and it'll come back to life and turn green like this, and is able to grow until until it dries out again. Our next plant is another lycophyte. It's called Persia squarosa, the fir club moss, and like Selaginella, it's got really, really small leaves. This plant is native to Southeast Asia, where it grows in tropical environments. It's a type of plant that grows on other plants, so it's what's called an epiphyte. And this particular plant likes to grow on tree trunks or in sort of especially a fork in a tree trunk, and it'll grow there and hang down like this. It grows in an area that gets rainfall all year round, so it doesn't need the adaptations to drying out that Selaginella watsonii has. This particular species of fir club moss has a chemical inside called huperzine. Huperzine is being studied now as a treatment for Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. Our next plant is Welwitschia, Welwitschia mirabilis. Welwitschia is a type of gymnosperm. So gymnosperms are plants that produce seeds but don't have flowers. Some other gymnosperms that you're probably familiar with are things like pine trees and fir trees and juniper. Well, this particular gymnosperm belongs to a group called gnetophytes, and they're kind of an odd group of plants. In some cases, they have some characteristics very similar to angiosperms or flowering plants, but they're not flowering plants. This particular gnetophyte grows in southern Africa in the Namib Desert, and this is an area that receives almost no rainfall during the year, about 2 millimeters of rainfall a year. And it has some adaptations to deal with that. If you look at it, it's got these two long leaves coming out here, and it will only ever have two leaves. These plants can grow for thousands of years, and they'll only ever have these two leaves. And they just keep on growing from the base, and they grow longer and longer and longer. And as they get longer, they'll split into sort of smaller pieces at the ends and kind of get a little bit frayed. And over time, over hundreds to thousands of years, these plants will grow into big clumps of just these tangled leaves. Now, the area where these plants grow, there's no rainfall, but there's a lot of fog. It's foggy there 50 to 90 times a year. And what scientists have found is that this plant, it's got roots that curve up towards the top layer of the soil. And what these roots are, why they're doing that is because when it is foggy, this sort of clumpy vegetation that these plants have, the clumping together of the leaves, allows the water and fog to kind of condense on the leaves and drip down onto the soil. And then having roots really close to the top layer of the soil allows this plant to absorb that water and to grow. And scientists have been able to verify that by looking at isotope ratios in water. The isotope ratio of oxygen and hydrogen is different in fog water, water that comes from fog, than in water that comes from rainfall. And so by looking at the ratio of those isotopes in the plant, it's possible to figure out where the plant is getting its water from. And in this case, Welwitschia is getting almost all of its water from fog. Our next plant is Needham, Needham nemon. Needham is another needophyte, and so it's in the same group as Welwitschia, but it's a large tree. And it looks quite different from Welwitschia. If you look at the leaves, they look kind of just like normal leaves that you'd expect to find in flowering plants. Long, big leaves. They have a lot of veins that are branching in the leaves. If you look here, you can see the veins. But this is, again, a gymnosperm. So it's related to conifers like pines and fir trees, and it's related also to things like juniper and other gymnosperms, plants that produce seeds in structures often called cones or cone-like structures, and that don't produce flowers. So this particular species is a tropical plant. It has evergreen leaves, so it doesn't normally lose its leaves. It grows in moist tropical forests in Southeast Asia. And this plant is dioecious, which means that it has, some plants have female reproductive structures and some plants have male reproductive structures. The male reproductive structures are little cone-like organs that produce pollen, and then the female reproductive structures that occur on other plants. So there's never male and female reproductive structures on the same plant. They're on different plants. The female reproductive structures, when they get pollinated, they produce a structure that's kind of fleshy and in many ways very, very fruit-like, but it's not a fruit. It's actually a specialized type of cone-like structure called a strobilus, and plural is strobili. And people actually eat these things. The seeds can be smashed and they're deep fried and they're used as kind of a cracker in Southeast Asia. Let's see, what else can I tell you? This plant here is a male plant, so SJSU only has a male Needham. We don't have a female one. And again, the leaves are nice and broad and big and very much not what you would expect for most gymnosperms. I also, since I'm here, I want to point out these two fern-like things here. These are actually another example of lycophytes here. These are called tassel ferns. And if you look, let me back up a little bit. If you look, they hang down like this, and like the other lycophytes, they have lots of small leaves. They don't have large leaves like the Needham or like a regular type of fern. And if you look here at the bottom, I'm going to bring this up so you can see this. This is where the spores are produced in these sort of structures down here. Our next plant is island pitcher sage, Lepicinia fragrans. Island pitcher sage is a flowering plant. You can see the flowers here. And if you came back at the right time, you would also be able to see the fruit on here. Island pitcher sage grows in Southern California on rocky slopes, and also on the Channel Islands, which is where it gets its name from. If you look at the arrangement of its leaves, it always has two leaves that are coming out of each node. So if you look here, here's the node. You can see there are two leaves coming out here. Maybe it helps to switch this around so you can see a little bit better. You can see there are two leaves coming out here. The leaves of pitcher sage are really furry and they're also quite fragrant. This is a member of the mint family, Lamiaceae, and pitcher sage has chemicals in its leaves called monoterpenes that give it that very strong fragrance. Monoterpenes are known to protect the plant to some degree from insects that may want to eat the leaves, and also maybe a protection against fungi and bacteria. So it's sort of a protection against disease and insects or herbivores that might want to eat the leaves. This plant, because it grows in a very, very rocky, kind of dry area, it has an adaptation for that called drought deciduousness. So it can, in the summer, if it gets really dry, it will actually drop its leaves, or the leaves will die, and the plant will go dormant until there's enough rainfall for it to sprout new leaves and grow again. And that's an adaptation for dealing with times of the year when there just isn't enough water to support having leaves. The hairiness on the leaves is another adaptation for living in a very dry environment. These hairy leaves reduce the amount of sunlight that's reaching sort of the surface of the leaves, and they also create what's called a boundary layer. So they create a little layer of air around the leaf that is constantly there, and that prevents a lot of evaporation of water off of the leaves. So there's sort of like a layer of air close to the leaf that's really saturated in water, but it stays right there near the surface of the leaf, and that prevents water in great amounts from evaporating off of the leaves. Our next plant is an angiosperm, and it's native to California. It's California coffeeberry, Frangula californica. And if you look at this plant, you'll see it's got some fruit on it. It actually has some flowers that are just getting ready to open. Let's see if I can find them there, but they're not quite. Well, actually, they've already been pollinated, so we're a little bit too late to see those when they're in flower. But those are immature fruit. They're in the center of the screen. If you look at this plant, it's got alternate leaves. So leaves, the number of leaves that come out of each node, there's only one leaf. Look at this here where one of these leaves is coming out, and there's a little bud just kind of above my fingernail. And each one of these nodes, there's only one leaf that comes out. This plant, like I said, it's got evergreen leaves. It's native to California. It was used by early settlers as a substitute for coffee, but it really wasn't a very good substitute. It's got very, very bitter seeds, even if you roast them, and it doesn't taste really very much like coffee, although I can't say I've tried it myself. The plant has some other medicinal uses. The bark was used by Native Americans as a laxative. A lot of Native Americans in California eat a diet that's very, very high in acorns, and acorns cause a lot of constipation. And so by also drinking tea made from the bark, or otherwise consuming the bark of the plant of California coffeeberry, Native Americans were kind of able to get things flowing again, if you know what I mean.
We're here in the atrium of Duncan Hall, and we're going to talk about these two trees, the Canyon live oak, and then over here, the island oak. These two tree species are both native to California, and they're each other's closest relatives. So they separated evolutionarily very recently in time. So let's look at the leaves really quickly, so that we can talk about the morphological features. The first thing to notice is that both of these have very hard, leathery leaves, which is typical of a lot of species in California. And that has to do with the drought conditions and the Mediterranean climates that we have here in California. So it's a means for being able to photosynthesize even when there's not much water in the environment. So this is the island oak, and you can see it's got the stronger veins and more convex leaf shape, and it's green on the underside. And the Canyon live oak has, in this particular branch, smaller leaves, and it's whitish underneath, and the veins aren't as prominent. But overall, there's a lot of similarity between these two leaves. And that's because these two species are actually very closely related. And they probably split within the last 3 to 5 million years. And one of the interesting things geographically about these two species is the canyon live oak remains today one of the most common species in California. So it's all the way from Oregon down to Southern California and then the Coast Ranges and the Sierras. Whereas the island oak, it was once very common, and we know that from the fossil record, but today it occurs only on the Channel Islands, which are a group of islands off the coast of Southern California. And this is an important kind of example of what happens over geological time in terms of species distributions. Some species that used to thrive in the past continue to thrive, and then other species which used to thrive in the past, and again we know this from the fossil record, are now very rare and are of conservation priorities. All right, here we have Cunninghamia, the China fir, and this, in contrast to the oaks that we were just talking about, is an example of a very, very old species. So this currently grows in East Asia, but this species, we know from the fossil record, is about 200 million years old. So you can compare that to the oaks that we were just looking at that are only a couple million years old. So some species persist for a great deal of time, and other ones come into existence and then blink out very quickly. So for reference, 200 million years is about the time when the dinosaurs began. So the dinosaurs went from about 200 million years ago up to about 65 million years ago. So this single species, as we know it, existed all throughout the reign of the dinosaurs and into the current day. So let's look at some of the morphological features of this plant. You can see the leaves are very simple. They look kind of similar to needles or scales. So it's a very simple leaf, which is characteristic of most gymnosperms. And then here we have the reproductive structures. So this larger structure is a female cone. That's where the seeds are produced. And then these small structures here are the male cones, and this is where the pollen is produced. So unlike the angiosperms or the flowering plants, the gymnosperms produce both the eggs and the sperm in structures that are sort of like cones instead of flowers. Here we have another species, the California nutmeg, and this is an example of a species that has an intermediate age. So we talked about the oaks that have very young ages, and then the China fir, which is a very, very old species. And the California nutmeg is a species with an intermediate age. It's about 30 million years old. And its closest relative actually lives in Florida. And so what we think happened is that this is a case of vicariance. So about 30 million years ago, climate in North America was quite different. As it dried out over those last 30 million years, the population that once spread all across North America separated and became isolated into a patch in Florida and a patch here in California. And eventually, with enough time, those two patches became different species. So let's look at the morphology of this species, which is something that you can find growing up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So it's got very long and very sharp individual needles. So this is a gymnosperm again, so similar to the China fir and similar to pine trees, has these single sort of needle-like, very simple leaves. And then we can see the reproductive structures on here. And this individual that grows in the atrium of Duncan Hall produces both male and female cones. The female cones aren't out right now, but we can see the male cones here. And so these are what are going to produce the pollen. And then, like most gymnosperms, these have wind-dispersed pollen, so they don't rely on bees or other insects. It just relies on the wind moving the pollen around from the male part of the plant to the female part of the plant. All right, here we are by the Spartan Memorial, and this huge tree behind me is a coastal redwood. So this is the state tree of California, and it's one of the most common trees in the Santa Cruz Mountains and along the coast up all the way to Oregon. And this is the first example of several gymnosperms that we're going to be talking about to talk about the diversity and the ecological importance of that group of plants. So the first thing to notice, if we look at the leaves of the redwood tree, is that similar to pines and other gymnosperms, they're very simple, needle-like structures. And one of the interesting things about the coastal redwood is it actually has two different leaf types, and that depends on the position on the plant where these leaves are growing. So in the shade, the leaves look like this, and so they spread out and they flatten to maximize the photosynthetic area. And then in the sun, the leaves look like this, and so they become much more needle-like. And what they're doing here is they're actually maximizing the volume to surface area ratio. And the reason that that's really important is because the volume corresponds to how much photosynthesis the plant can do, and the surface area corresponds to how much water it loses during photosynthesis. And so by minimizing the amount of surface area, what it's able to do is live in a really dry climate like the one that we have here in California. And so the reason that you get dissimilarity between the shade leaves and the sun leaves is because these leaves are actually living in very different environments. So you can see the shaded under part of the tree has a very, very different environment than these sun leaves, which occur way out on the branches and at the top of the tree. So it's a really effective strategy that these plants have, and that a lot of plants have, because plants don't have legs. They can't walk around to optimize the environment that they live in, so they have to kind of deal with the environment where they're rooted. Here are the cones of the coastal redwood, and we're going to be comparing these to another species in just a minute. But each one of these scales produces a single cone, and so so each one of these cones is going to produce maybe 20 or so seeds. And so we'll be comparing this to some closely related species in just a minute. So now we're standing on the opposite side of the Spartan Memorial from the large redwood, and we're standing in front of this tree right here, which is called a dawn redwood. It's a very close relative of the coastal redwood, and this species is native to China. And one of the interesting things about this one is that it actually was unknown to Western science as a living species until the middle of the 20th century. So we've only really known about it for less than 75 years. It was very well known to paleontologists who knew it from the fossil record going back tens of millions of years all over Asia. But it was just very recently kind of rediscovered by scientists who were from North America, and they went over on an expedition and then brought seeds back. And so now pretty much every college campus, at least in California, has at least a couple representatives of this species. And so one of the big differences between the dawn redwood and the coastal redwood, if you look at the leaves, it's just leafing out right now in mid-March. And so that's a big difference from the coastal redwood. They don't drop off every year and reform, whereas in a deciduous plant like the dawn redwood, the leaves fall off in the autumn and then grow back in the springtime. Another important difference is in the cone morphology. So they have very similar cones to the coastal redwood. So here are the cones of the coastal redwood, and then here are the cones of the dawn redwood. And you can see they're similar in shape and size, but if you look closely at the scales on the coastal redwood, the scales kind of spiral up around the stem, the central axis of the cone, whereas in the dawn redwood, the scales are opposite to each other. So these cones were very well known from the fossil record, and so when botanists in the mid 20th century found these things living on the dawn redwood, they were very excited about it. All right, so here we've got another gymnosperm species called the Atlas cedar, or the blue Atlas cedar. And this is a plant that grows natively in North Africa, in the mountains of Morocco and Algeria. And one of the most distinctive things about this particular group of plants is the very distinctive bluish, grayish color of the needles. So this is another gymnosperm, so it has needles like a pine tree, but note the color. And so that color comes from a waxy substance that helps to prevent water loss. And so basically the entire leaf surface is covered in this waxy exudate. And so what that does is it helps when the plant is photosynthesizing, it's going to be releasing water, and so this waxy substance kind of prevents the water from leaking out between the cell walls. And it's got these real fine needles similar to pine tree. But one of the things to notice that separates one of these from a true pine, like the pines we have that are native here in California, is each one of these needles, if you pull them off, each needle is individual, and so you can pull off one at a time. So if you ever look at a true pine, like the ones that grow here in California, out in the mountains, the needles come off in groups, little groups called fascicles. And so those are actually little clusters of leaves, where the cedars have individual needles. And because they're gymnosperms, they produce cones instead of flowers. And these are actually the male cones. So there's no female cones right now in the late winter, early spring. But you can see the morphology is very similar to what you think of as a pine cone. And you may be even just able to see that kind of yellowy, powdery stuff. That's the pollen, because this is a male cone, so it's producing pollen, whereas the female cones produce seeds. So what'll happen is the wind will blow through, and like you can see over on this branch right here, it'll blow through all of these little cones and capture a bunch of the pollen on the wind, and then that wind hopefully will make it to a female cone where pollination can take place. So a lot of the gymnosperms have this wind pollination that doesn't rely on bees or butterflies or other insects to move pollen around. All right, and so for our next gymnosperm, we've got the Monterey cypress. So this is a very large tree that's native to California. And it's actually, it used to have a much broader range, but today the native range is basically a few hundred yards in Point Lobos State Park down near Monterey and surrounding areas. But this is one of the most common trees you'll see along the coastline of California. People have liked it for a long time, so they've planted it all up and down the coast. It's a very charismatic tree. It's really big, really showy, and so Californians for the last several hundred years have valued it for its aesthetic. So it's a gymnosperm as well, and so it's got cones and very small leaves, and in this case, instead of needles like a pine tree, if you can see very finely, these little green cylindrical structures, these actually aren't leaves, these are stems. And so each one of them is covered by what looks like kind of lizard skin or snake skin, these little scales, and each individual scale is actually a leaf. So these have kind of gone to the extreme in terms of reducing their leaf size to help with reducing water loss during photosynthesis, and gone to just producing these tiny scales. The reproductive structures are cones, just like with any gymnosperm. So these have what are called serotinous cones. So in nature, very often you'll see a cone that looks like this, with the scales kind of glued together. And then when it gets warm, and so either on a hot day or if there's a forest fire, the cones will actually open up and the scales pop apart to release the seeds. And so that's a mechanism so that the seeds are only dispersed under certain conditions. So these are the female cones that bear the seeds, and then out at the tips of the branches we have the male cones. And so again, like most of the gymnosperms, you have both the pollen and the seeds produced in cones, but in separate cones that are on different parts of the tree. So here we are still near the Spartan Memorial, and I want to talk about one more tree that looks just like a gymnosperm but is actually not. So this is called a she oak, and believe it or not, it's actually not an oak either. This is a flowering plant that lives in similar environments to gymnosperms, which often live in fairly dry areas, either areas without a lot of precipitation or areas with really poor soil quality that doesn't hold on to the water. And so if you look closely at the leaves of this plant, it looks actually just very much like pine needles. But these structures that look like needles are actually stems. And if you look very closely, you may be able to see that these are jointed. So it looks like maybe just like a little tiny piece of bamboo. It's got joints going up and down that structure. So this entire structure is a stem. And so the leaves have basically been modified to be reduced to such an extent that they're actually now absent. And so you get the convergence on this cylindrical leaf shape, which again is an adaptation to living in dry environments, because you have a reduction of the surface area relative to the photosynthetic volume of the leaf. And these structures that look very much like cones are actually seed pods that are produced from flowers. So each one of the little bumps on each one of these balls, each bump is the product of a flower that produces a little tiny seed in there. So these actually are flowering plants that just happen to have these kind of cone-looking structures, and then they happen to have these leaves that are very similar to gymnosperms. So don't be confused. All right, so now we're going to talk about some ferns, which is a different group of plants. So we've been talking about gymnosperms, which are the seed-bearing vascular plants that don't produce flowers. And we briefly mentioned the bryophytes, which are non-vascular plants, so they don't have vascular tissue. They also don't produce seeds. And then what we're going to talk about right now are the ferns. So ferns have true roots and vascular tissue, just like a flowering plant, but they don't produce seeds, and so they also don't produce flowers or fruit. So instead they reproduce by unicellular spores. So this is the sword fern that's very common here in California. It lives underneath the redwoods out in nature. So this is pretty easy to see if you go up in the Santa Cruz Mountains or anywhere up the coast of California. And so ferns very typically have leaves that come out of a stem that may in some cases be underground. So in this case, the stem is this structure that all these leaves are emanating from, and this individual structure here is one leaf. So in ferns we call the leaves fronds, and some of these can be quite large. And when you look at the underside of a fern frond or fern leaf, you can see these little tiny brown dots. These dots are called sori. And each sorus, which is the singular of sori, is composed of a number of sporangia, and those are the structures that produce the spores. So in these plants, the reproductive structures are actually housed underneath the leaves, so under the undersurface of the leaves. And some times of the year, they won't produce these, and other times they will. And the features that you typically use to identify fern species in nature very often have to do with the ornamentation and the arrangement of these little sori. So this is the California sword fern, which is again something that you're very likely to see if you're out hiking in cool, wet areas along the coast. And then we have another fern that's pretty commonly planted here on campus, which is called a Dixonia, which is a kind of a tree fern. So you can see this one actually has a bit of a trunk down here. And so these plants in nature can actually get to be as much as 50 feet tall. So they grow to be proper trees. And so again, they're ferns, so they have fronds. And so this whole structure here is a single leaf that I'm holding. And it's important to note that ferns, unlike flowering plants and gymnosperms, don't actually produce true wood. So that structure there is sort of wood-like, but anatomically it's very, very different from wood. And this is one of the reasons why we see lots of gymnosperms that are trees and lots of angiosperms that are trees, but actually very few ferns that reach that kind of tree status. So if we look at the underside of these fern fronds, you can see all these little balls, and so those balls are the sori. And so these are what are going to, they're a little bit green now, but they will mature into those little spore producing structures. And so again, the spores are produced there, and then they will float out into the environment and eventually drop on some soil, and they will produce a haploid gametophyte. And that gametophyte, similar to the bryophytes, produces male and female sex organs that then allow the gametophytes to have sex, and then they produce the diploid offspring, which is this large plant here. All right, so now we're standing outside the faculty offices building, and I want to introduce you to this large and pretty impressive plant. This is a kind of a cycad. It's called a giant dioon. And cycads are a really interesting group of gymnosperms. So the angiosperms are the flowering plants, and the gymnosperms are the plants that produce seeds but not flowers. And so within the gymnosperms, there are several important lineages. So one of those is the conifers, and that's mostly what we've been talking about today. And then another one is the nidophytes, which include nidum, which we saw up in the greenhouse. It had the kind of strange broad leaves that are atypical for a gymnosperm. Another one is the ginkgo, and then finally we have the cycads. And so these, even though they look kind of like a fern, they're actually much more closely related to pine trees. And so they have a similar morphology to ferns, where they have a little bit of a stem down there, and in some species that stem can become tree-like. And then each one of these large structures here is a single leaf. And then you can see it's just divided into leaflets, and these are very, very tough. So much more in terms of texture, they're much more like pine needles than they are like fern fronds. And so a lot of these cycads live in pretty arid areas, that means dry areas. And so having really tough leaves is good in terms of not being eaten by herbivores, and it also helps to hold up the leaves so they can continue photosynthesizing even when they're under water stress, where most species that don't have tough leaves would just wilt under that same water stress. So cycads are a really important ornamental group of plants, and so they're one of the most poached group of plants in the world, and very often the wild populations will be harvested, and so they're of extreme conservation concern. All right, so we're still outside of faculty offices, and this tree right here is our first angiosperm. So this is the southern magnolia. It's a very common tree planted all over California, although it's native to the southeastern United States. It's the state tree of about a half a dozen of the southern states. And the magnolia has these characteristic broad, green, tough, leathery leaves. And then they have a reproductive structure that actually looks very much like a cone, even though this is a flowering plant. So the magnolias will produce a very large, sometimes like softball to even like maybe a kid's soccer ball sized big white flowers. And then you can actually see a lot of the floral anatomy even in this cone-like fruiting structure. So all of these things here are the pistils, and so each one of these produced a single seed. And then there's a bunch of dots down here, and that's where the stamens were attached. So if you remember, a flower has the female parts in the middle, that's the pistil, and then it has the stamens just outside those. And then there's some other scars down here, which is where the tepals were attached. And tepal is a word that we use when a plant doesn't have differentiated petals and sepals. And so in this case, there's no distinct green sepals as compared to the colored petals, so we call all of those structures tepals. And this is actually a characteristic of the way that probably the very first flowers on the planet looked. They probably had many pistils, and they probably had really big, white, undifferentiated tepals. And so this makes the magnolia a really nice example of how flowers probably looked close to when flowers first originated. And magnolias actually diverged or separated from the main kind of evolutionary group of angiosperms very early on in the evolution of flowering plants. All right, so now we're standing outside the Spartan complex, and we have another early diverging angiosperm, similar in evolutionary position to the magnolia that we were just talking about. And the camphor tree, which is the name of this tree, is native to China. And it's also, like the magnolia, a very commonly planted street tree around California. And one of the reasons that it's commonly planted, and same with magnolia, is it's quite drought tolerant because it has these fairly tough, and you can hear it's a little bit brittle almost, the leaves. And one of the great things about this tree is if you're walking by one on campus, you can crush those leaves and then you can actually smell them, and they have a really characteristic odor that smells of camphor, which is where this plant gets its name. But having these really broad, dark green, leathery to brittle leaves with very few serrations around the outside, these are all characteristics of the very first angiosperms that evolved. And so a lot of these what we call early diverging species, or species that evolved very early in the history of flowering plant evolution, have retained those ancestral characteristics. They also have flowers that are kind of similar to the magnolia, except they're very small, in that they have a lot of stamens and kind of undifferentiated floral parts. And so the magnolias and the camphor and their relatives evolved very early in the history of angiosperms, and so they basically split off from angiosperms prior to when you get a lot of the floral specialization, which is associated mostly with insect pollination. And so a lot of these are actually not pollinated by bees and butterflies like most of the angiosperms, but instead are pollinated very often by beetles and other kind of more generalist pollinators. Sitting beneath this pitcher plant are two of the bryophyte groups, some liverworts and some mosses. As you can see, the liverworts are these flat thalloid structures, and then the mosses are the ones tucked in between. They've got little leaves and stems that are photosynthetic, as is the liverwort. So these are true plants, unlike a lichen, which is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and a photosynthetic partner. Mosses, liverworts, and the third group, the liverworts, comprise one of the most important groups of plants globally in terms of carbon storage and the carbon cycle, and a number of other important ecosystem functions. So you can see on these ones, they actually have the reproductive structures here. These are the sporophytes of the liverwort, and then over here we've got the sporophytes of the moss. So both mosses and liverworts have alternation of generations, where the generations are different and they alternate between haploid, dominant, and diploid. All right, so we're standing outside the library now, and we're standing in front of this big wall of giant bamboo. And bamboo is an example of a monocot, which is one of the major groups of flowering plants. So within the angiosperms of the flowering plants, we have the eudicots, which are most of the diversity. And then we have a few early diverging plants, and that's examples of those are the magnolia and the camphor tree that we already saw. And then the other major group are the monocots. And these include plants that have mostly parallel veins. So you can see on this leaf, the veins in there actually run parallel down the length of the leaf, which is different from the leaves of most plants that you see around that have some kind of a net-like venation. And so bamboos are actually just a very large grass, and so very much like the grass that we're standing on, they have a stem and leaf morphology with kind of leaves coming off the stem. But in the case of grasses, you get kind of soft, pliable stems, even on perennial plants. But the bamboos are a specialized group of grasses that have grown to tree status. And so the bamboo, you may have seen, if you look, you can see actually right here, they're hollow in the center. Then that hollow core is surrounded by a very, very flexible, kind of fibrous type of structure that's actually not like true wood. So bamboo doesn't have growth rings and doesn't experience that same kind of lateral growth or secondary growth that we see in both gymnosperms and in eudicots. So they're a very specialized group of plants. Bamboos are some of the fastest growing plants in the world, and also some of the strongest. There's a lot of parts of the world, for example, that still use bamboo for scaffolding in building construction, and the sort of material properties of bamboo are starting to catch on in a lot of different manufacturing settings. All right, so here we've got one more interesting group of monocots. We just talked about the bamboos and how they're quite different from the other groups of eudicots. So the palms, and so here we have a Mediterranean fan palm. So you can see it's got this, this is one individual leaf of the palm, and so it's kind of a fan-like structure. It has a sort of a base, a stalk there, and then you can see all the leaflets radiating out from a central point. So this is one kind of a group of palms. And then if you look all the way up, this is the date palm, Canary Island date palm. And so each one of those large structures is an individual leaf. So each one of those can be 2 or 3 meters long. So each one of those leaves, you can see each one of those has this kind of a central axis, and it has a structure much more like a feather as opposed to these fan-like structures on the Mediterranean fan palms. So palm trees are flowering plants, and this Mediterranean fan palm actually has some fruits right here that were derived from flowers. They occur in these little clusters in on the trunk. So here's the trunk of that palm, and out of the top of it we get a cluster of leaves. And so here is a young developing leaf right here, and then each one of these little inflorescences or clusters of flowers that is now turned into fruit. So similar to kind of typical eudicot wildflowers and trees, these are very often pollinated by insects, unlike most of the gymnosperms. The palm trees, however, don't have the typical kind of woody structure that your typical eudicot tree has. And so when we look at a typical eudicot like this mulberry right here, you see the largest branch is the trunk, and then it branches up into all these little increasingly finer and finer ramifications or branches. And that's very different from the architecture of both of these palms. So the Mediterranean fan palm is kind of a cluster of individual trunks, and then the really big Canary Island date palm is just a single trunk. And so palm trees typically are not branched, and that relates to the internal anatomy of the stem, which we can see in this one that's been cut down. So it's this one really large structure, and then from that kind of basal structure we have a bunch of stems rising up. And so in this cross section right here, you can see there's no growth rings. There's just lots of little tiny, they look like pinpricks, and so those are all indicating fibers, and quite similar to these fibers that are forming the outer layer. The fibers are densely packed inside the stem, and so that's one of the reasons why these palm trees can grow like this Canary Island date palm, is they're very flexible in the wind, and so they have the ability to kind of withstand really strong winds. And so if you think about the diameter to height ratio of a palm tree relative to something like a skyscraper, palm trees are much more have much more structural integrity than our building materials like stone and even reinforced concrete and steel. And these palm trees they're very different, both in terms of their leaf morphology as well as in their internal stem anatomy from the eudicots.